Good day, I'm Isa Q. Tan, editor of Asian Pork Magazine. I'm happy to welcome you to another podcast from Asian Agribiz. In this interview, our regional correspondent Hatu talks to Siegfried Bank about climate change and the trends in greenhouse gas emission reduction and how these tie in to the Asian livestock industry. Dr. Bank is the owner of ChiPro GmbH, a German consulting and trading company focused on the upcycling of food residues, value chain development, and market access support for food and other life sciences products with sustainable origin. His company is widely active in Asia, Africa, and Europe.
Hello, Dr. Bank. Thank you for accepting to talk in this podcast of Asian Agribiz.
Thank you for having me too. I'm very happy to be here with you.
Dr. Bank, perhaps you've noticed one of the latest important events of our world is the US-led Climate Change Summit on April 22nd, in which US President Joe Biden vowed to reduce greenhouse gas emissions by at least 50% by 2030. That is more than double of the country's prior commitment under the 2015 Paris Climate Agreement. So, Dr. Bank, what do you think are the driving factors for these commitments?
I think there are 3 points which I would like to mention here at the beginning. One is that scientists already since several years are pointing out that the greenhouse emission and the warming of the earth, the rising of the oceans, climate changes are a severe threat to our world, and it hasn't been taken really seriously until pretty recently. Meanwhile, the population in many countries, if I talk about Europe, definitely here, has become aware of this, and they are putting kind of pressure also on the governments to change behaviors. But something else has appeared relatively recently, and that's that the investors are aware of this threat as well. Many of the important investors have decided that they only will invest in the future into projects which have got a sustainability edge. And it's not because of they're worried about humanity on their side, but they're also worried about their investments. You can imagine that if somebody's investing in the coastal areas of Asia and the sea is rising, that this investment is endangered as well. And the same is right for the United States or for Europe. So they're taking care of their investment and are also for a change in business and in life behavior, if you like, in a certain way.
I see. So how about Asia in particular? What is the relevance of this issue for Asia?
I think you have many indications that climate change is also relevant for Asia. In areas where I have been, like for instance, Jakarta, I see increasing and more severe floods every year. The city is underwater, the harbor is underwater, and so on. So here are already quite heavy damages also to the business environment. Know that the Mekong Delta is particularly vulnerable here. If I remember, the Philippines, all the storms I've seen there, and all the damages which are declared. Bangladesh is flooded regularly. So, and many of the islands you have in Asia are on sea level or maybe even in certain areas below. So these are all pretty much endangered areas for the further development. And the outlook, if we continue living as we do at the moment, is not very good. It's actually, dangerous, so to say, for important parts of the population on this world and also in Asia.
So how is the livestock industry in the region concerned in this issue?
if you look at agriculture in general, you can see that the holding of cattle is going with the highest CO2 footprint you may have. The smaller the animals, the less per kg on footprint you do have. I think that in the ordinary agriculture, things are fine as long as you don't destroy the environment for it. If you have, for instance, a situation like in Brazil where big parts of forests are burned down in order to keep cattle, this will add substantially to the carbon footprint in a negative way, of course. If you look at fish farming, this is relatively to cattle farming, for instance, more positive. But in the fish farming, you have a high use of electricity, and that's a problem here.
Okay, now I want to have a little technical background for this. Could you explain to me where do the main emissions come from? I mean, from which livestock farming activities?
And main emission come from cattle. As I understand, in Vietnam, you have a relatively low rate of cattle farming, but mainly work with pigs. Pigs are somewhere where in the middle. That's quite acceptable still. The other, and there's also, as long as you keep them outside and in a fairly natural way, there's also little you can change there. Another aspect is, for instance, in fish farming. Fish farming as such has got a relatively lower footprint than cattle. But in the farming technology, you have a lot of electricity you use for ventilating the water. And in this respect, you could change things and also save a lot of energy, and with that, lower your carbon footprint.
Okay, so specifically, what can be done to tackle the main emissions factors? Would reducing electricity use help?
I think that in fish farming, there are two main factors which have to be considered. One is the electricity. If you look at the footprint from different activities in fish farming, then you will see that the use of electricity is nearly half of the whole rate of CO2 emission. Another part which is relevant is the methane exposure, so that if when your feed is going down to the ground and it decays, there is again greenhouse gas being extruded into the air. And the third factor, which is also relevant, is the use of space and mangrove areas. The mangrove areas are a compensation for CO2 footprint, for CO2 emissions. If you cut them down, then the CO2 is less absorbed from the air. So this means that you would have an interest of preserving the farms in the way that they are keeping in one area as long as possible. And this also has to do with electricity in the sense that if you could use electricity to the extent you really want, then you wouldn't have any additional running costs if you, for instance, install automatic feeding machines. Automatic feeding machines would distribute the feed for the shrimps very evenly, so that the feed can be absorbed by the shrimp nearly 100%, unless it's going to the ground, unless it's decaying and producing methane. To get to this objective of having as much electricity as you want, or only with fixed cost, it's recommended to use solar panels, which is done in Vietnam already a lot, I understand. But you also need night energy, because you have to also oxygenize the water in the evenings and at night when you don't have any sun, and you cannot gain any electricity through the solar panels. That means that you have to store the energy in one way or another. And here there are also new technologies and developed. If you discuss with cars and so on, there's a lot of research going into batteries. And meanwhile, we have new generations of batteries which don't need any lithium and don't need any rare earth, and which can be recycled at the end of their lifespan fully. And also they have a standing of about 20 years. So in your investment, you have a long-term investment which you can depreciate over a long time.
Oh, this is very interesting because in Vietnam, like what you've said, we have seen quite many projects that generate electricity from wind and solar energy, like in the Mekong Delta with the shrimp farming activities. The problem here is that the electricity from these projects is not fully consumed. And it's not easy to connect to the grid because it's related to infrastructure conditions and the government's policy on purchasing electricity. So what you've mentioned can be the solution for this issue. That is why it's very interesting. So what about the cost factor, and how would the finance market react to this issue?
I think that the development with solar panels, it's in the area for quite a while, but it has been boosted over the last years. And probably the electricity companies and also the governments have not been able to adjust with the same speed to that. So that feeding back into their systems is on the one hand technically maybe still a problem for in certain areas, and on the other hand, if they are geared to produce electricity from coal, then so there are several factors which we would have to look at in more detail in order to take them apart. Yes, indeed, these battery systems and solar systems and so on, they all cost money and they are not cheap, and it is but it is an investment in a long run for a long time range. And the other side is that investment in general for the fish industry in your areas, but the same is true for Europe to a certain extent, is not easy. So that's not so easy to get money. But when you look at what's happening right now, you mentioned the summit of Biden. And if you look into Germany now, or Europe in general, we have brought out a lot of money which is geared towards the development of alternative energy use and this reduction of CO2 footprint. And I think that this development will also be spread out into your areas. There are already investments which go into projects which have got sustainability aspects. The money has been gathered from private savers, so to say, from private households, which have kind of a conscience issue and which would like to invest in something good, and in reduction of carbon is of course one of these things which is on vogue at the moment and really makes a lot of sense. So what I'm saying is that I expect that your regional banks like the Asian Development Bank but also the World Bank and so on and European support systems, together with these private incentives, will come up increasingly with offers from the finance market for this kind of investment. But they will kind of do good due diligence. So that means that their investment should really go into systems which at the end can prove that they have saved this carbon emissions. So there should be concepts. And also you have to see that for the investors, small projects are more expensive than big projects. So there should be kind of maybe a regional incentive or an incentive of cooperatives or something like that, so that you can bundle the requirements, that you can bundle applications of these technologies, and then go with this bundle of project to find an investment.
Okay, so that is from the producing countries side. I mean, from the countries that are doing the farming, they are making the changes to reduce emissions in their production. What about the buying markets? What do they do to encourage these movements?
You probably have heard of carbon trade. In the carbon trade, the emission industries have to pay a certain amount of money for the carbon, or they can buy bonds, so to say, for which they can bring carbon out into the air. These costs for these bonds will probably increase in the very near future to quite an extent. That means that you can save money by reducing this footprint. And this leads to a situation, this I have to say this, together with buyer preference. The buyers are looking meanwhile also in their behavior what they would buy and with which purchases they would do the least harm to the environment. So these cost factors I mentioned for the high emission and the buyer preferences have led to the retail sector to coming up with certificates of climate neutrality. So it means that the supermarkets will increasingly have a green panel on their doors which saying we are carbon neutral. The have got a lot of emission of carbon by running their coolers and what have you. They're cooling down their surfaces or heating their surfaces and so on. So that means that they are not able really from one day to another to become carbon neutral. What they're doing is they're buying funds for compensation. So that means they're giving money into reforestation, into social projects, and so on and so on. So that means for them to be carbon neutral costs money. And their carbon neutrality is determined by their operation, so by the operation of their own supermarkets, and also by the products they're selling. So that means that if they can buy a product which is produced on a lower carbon level, that would add to their budget and they would have to pay less in compensation. What I want to say is they will be looking for products which have a low carbon footprint, and they will probably also pay a little bit more of money for this product than for others. So there is an incentive for the exporting country to look into their production to be as low carbon as possible. If you want to see where it's going, then you should look at the textile industry. In the textile industry, this movement is furthest developed, and I am persuaded that the food industry and other sectors will follow pretty soon.
Okay.
So it means there is a pull factor also from the buying market in this respect.
I see. So, given all of the efforts that have been developed in both producing and buying countries, what can be the expectation for the future development in this respect?
I think that the awareness of the danger of carbon emission, that populations all over the world will become more and more aware, also younger people, but not also only younger people, but also business people, for instance. I've seen an incentive of the ex-CEO of Unilever, a big company, not being really on the forefront of sustainability. He has gathered CEOs of other big companies, and they're proclaiming now to have a zero growth, because they say if we continue growing if our whole economy is based on growth all the time, then at the end of the day we will exhaust our planet. So I talked about the investors who have got a preference for sustainable investments in there. And on the other hand, I also know the discussion between Asia and Latin America and North and Western states, that we, Europe and especially the United States, are the biggest carbon producers worldwide, and this is not only since yesterday, but since ages. And we ask you now to reduce your carbon output, which seems to be unfair. But on the other hand, you have to consider that, I agree, we have to do a lot, and we are also in kind of an obligation of really moving in that respect. But on the other hand, I think it also has to be considered that the growth of carbon output in Asia is extremely high. That your economy is oriented to a great deal into quantitative growth. There, I would like to mention an aspect which is only secondary, directly connected here. But, for instance, Vietnam, has come to a kind of a trade agreement with the EU. The EU has in the past functioned in the way that they had kind of market barriers, so that further develop products with which had a higher value development, had to pay higher taxes at the borders. This has changed now. So you now have all the incentives to have a higher value production in your own country. What I mean is to look at not only of quantity. So if you can produce, for instance, a climate-friendly shrimp, which you can sell for slightly more than an ordinary shrimp, it makes sense in several aspects. On the one hand, you're making money, and and the other side is that you are doing something for the environment. And this example can be brought further and further. But I think we won't have the time to get to the end of this.
That is very encouraging to hear. From what you've shared, Dr. Bank, I believe we will see more attention paid in sustainable energy use and more innovation in reducing greenhouse gas emission in Asia livestock industry in the future. Dr. Bank, thank you very much for your very interesting insights, and we hope to hear from you more in future.
My pleasure too, and thanks a lot for hosting me.
We hope you found this discussion interesting. Among the take-home messages from this podcast are: 1. Asia is most vulnerable to climate change, especially the region's agriculture industry. 2. Agriculture is important, but currently in Asia, the goal is improving production quantity. Sustainability considerations are still minimal. This attitude must and will have to change soon. 3. Investing in climate change initiatives will help improve the image of livestock or seafood producers among buying markets like the EU and the US, who are leading in climate change and greenhouse gas emission reduction movements. With 24 years on the ground in Asia, Asian Agribiz offers you timely and relevant insights into the animal protein industry. Visit our website at www.asian-agribiz.com to listen to our other podcasts and get more information on the Asian animal protein industry.